Hello and welcome to a brand new, exciting story from Nordic Noir Stories, The Missing Child Under the Northern Lights. Chapter 1. The Night the Sky Burned. The darkness in Åsbacka was not the ordinary gentle darkness of night. This was the kaamos, the polar night, a thick, cold blanket of absence that swallowed sound and sealed off the horizon. 2 days had passed since the winter solstice, but the sun's return still felt miles away. There was an icy, almost static silence that filled the void left by the final closure of the iron ore mine 4 years prior. Eli Ekman, 40 years old, drove his rented, inconspicuous Volvo through the main street of Åsbacka, his birthplace. The street was a narrow black ribbon between towering mountains of piled snow. Every storefront he passed seemed boarded up. The sparse houses exhibited a sad uniformity of extinguished lamps. It was a village transformed into a frozen monument to a failed economic dream. The scars of the mine closure were not just financial. They cut deep into the soul of every resident. Eli's arrival was necessary, but far from welcome. He was a chief inspector from Stockholm, a man of the fast, loud city, now returned to the agonizing slowness of the north. To the people of Åsbacka, he was the boy who ran away. His mission, to lead the investigation into the disappearance of 2-year-old Linus Ström. 2 days earlier, the phone call had reached him in his small Södermalm apartment. He was sitting there, surrounded by the organized chaos of his unsolved cases, when Commissioner Borg called him. Åsbacka is asking for a local face, Ekman. Someone who knows how the snow smells there, and more importantly, how they keep silent. Your profile is unique. You know their mentality. This is a high-profile case, not patrol work. The boy has been missing for 36 hours now. The national media pressure is immense. They're feeding on the combination of a missing toddler and the northern lights. Eli had remained silent. Åsbacka, the place where he lost his little sister Astrid when he was 10. She was 7 years old. A case that was never officially closed, but had been suppressed by Eli with 30 years of work. The memory was a sharp, icy pain he thought he had successfully filed away. "What is the latest clue?" Eli had asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "It's hell," Borg had replied. "The disappearance happened around 8 p.m. The child was playing in the backyard with his father, Olof Ström. There was a rare, fierce aurora borealis that evening. Everyone in the village was staring at the sky. It looked like the apocalypse up there. No human witnesses saw the abduction, only the dancing green and purple lights above the frozen landscape. The boy vanished, just like that. A toddler disappeared under the gaze of the universe, without human witnesses. The ultimate nightmare. Eli put the car on the ferry near Sundsvall and began the long drive north, every kilometre a step back in time. He had read in the files that the father, Olof Ström, was the man who exposed the mine's financial fraud, leading to its final closure. Was this a criminal act or revenge? Eli parked his Volvo behind the local police unit, an old white van with 2 stuck snowmobiles. The Ström family home sat on the slope of the mountain, overlooking the frozen river below and the sealed mine shafts above. The symbolism was grim. They were trapped between their life source and their only way out. The cold was intense, biting, and cut into his lungs. It was -25°C, and Eli's training in Stockholm had not prepared him for this. A local sergeant, a towering man named Jens, met Eli at the front door. Jens was a massive figure, the type Eli remembered from his youth, with shoulder-wide sturdiness. Jens looked at Eli with a mixture of respect for the inspector and resentment for the former town resident who had left. "Welcome back, Eli. Or should I say, Inspector Ekman?" Jens's voice was heavy and monotonous, as if he had forgotten how to speak in solitude. "Eli's fine, Jens. What's the situation inside? The media hasn't arrived yet, I assume?" "Not yet, but they're coming. Inside, despair is absolute. The mother, Sophia Ström, is heavily sedated. The father, Olof Ström, is downstairs. He's the only witness, but he just repeats the story about the Northern Lights. He's a wreck, understandably. The atmosphere in the house was one of unbearable suffering. The smell of cold coffee, fear, and the sweet, sharp scent of the pine branches the Ströms had tried to incorporate into their Christmas decorations, a poignant attempt at normalcy. Eli focused his attention on the backyard, the crime scene. A plastic swing set stood there, half buried in the snow. The wooden fence was low and functional. The tracks of the search teams were everywhere, chaotic indentations in the white sheet. Could Linus have left the yard on his own? Eli asked. Impossible. He was wearing too heavy a winter suit to move quickly, and the snow is too deep. Furthermore, no prints of his were found, nor any prints leading to the road. He was picked up from here, lifted presumably. Eli nodded. An abduction then, planned, and timed with the rarest natural distraction. Jens led Eli to a kitchen table where the few pieces of evidence were gathered. A photo of Linus, a child with bright, curious eyes, and a red woolen hat. And next to it, the single, mysterious trace the search teams had found. It was a small, hand-carved wooden reindeer. It was no tourist dollar horse, but a rough, symbolic piece of carving. The wood was old, dark, and felt soft to the touch. The reindeer was missing a back leg, as if it had been hastily yanked from the snow. Found about 500 meters away, on the path to the old mine, a few hours after the boy disappeared, Jens explained. We thought it was a toy the boy dropped. Eli touched the wood. It felt strangely familiar. He recognized the style. This wasn't modern trinket. This is not a toy, Eli said softly. This is a sign, a code. He turned the figure over. Scratched into the base of the reindeer were small, weathered initials. A.E. A cold shock ran through Eli, worse than the freezing temperatures. A.E. Astrid Ekman, the initials of his sister, who vanished 30 years ago. It wasn't a coincidence. Linus Ström's abduction was not a random act. It was a message directed at him. Someone in Åsbacka knew about his personal tragedy. Someone was using the toddler's disappearance to lure Eli back and confront him with the long buried sin of his own youth. Eli looked around the kitchen, now with a sharp, almost predatory gaze. The miner's son, the inspector from the city, was now back in his role. He needed to talk to Olof Ström, the father whose exposure of mining corruption had brought this fate upon his family. But the case had shifted. Take me to Olof Ström, Eli said to Jens. His voice was firm. The fatigue of Stockholm was gone, replaced by the cold determination of the hunter. Eli had not returned to Åsbacka to solve a case. He had returned to unearth his own history. The perpetrator had made that clear with two simple scratched letters. Chapter 2. The Legacy of the Mine. The air in Olofström's small study was heavy with the smell of strong tobacco and unprocessed grief. The curtains were tightly drawn, and the only illumination came from a desk lamp casting a harsh yellow light on a stack of financial files. This was the place where Olofström, the whistleblower, had done the work that tore apart the soul of Åsbacka. Olof slumped in a leather armchair. He was a middle-aged man whose beard was unkempt and whose eyes were dull from lack of sleep and fear. The silence around him was an envelope of guilt. Eli sat down opposite him, the wooden reindeer clasped between his hands. Jens stood silently by the door, his massive presence a physical barrier against the outside world. "Olof," Eli began softly, "I know you are suffering unbearably. We don't have the kidnapper's name yet, but we do have a clue about his motive. It has to do with the mine." Eli slid the reindeer across the table toward Olof. "Do you recognize this?" Olof looked at the carving, and his gaze turned to stone. He touched it with the back of his finger. Where did this come from?" "It was found in the snow, on the path to the mine," Eli replied. "It is the only trace. Do you know the initials, Olof? A.E." Olof slowly shook his head, but his eyes were fixed on the missing leg. "No, the initials mean nothing to me. But that reindeer, that is a figure of the first families, the first fodder, the families who founded the mine more than 100 years ago." He explained the tradition in detail. The reindeer were carved by the original carvers, such as Einar Hegg, and were symbols of protection for the children of the founders. They represented the inner circle of the mine. This reindeer is at least 30, 40 years old. It is a relic, Olof continued. If the leg is broken, it signifies a transfer, that the child has been passed on to another protector, or to a perpetrator who knows the code and wants us to know that Linus is not a runaway, but a trophy. This confirmed Eli's suspicion. This was not about random revenge. This was personal, layered, and connected to the deepest, most elite secrets of the community. The perpetrator had to be one of the first fodder, or someone who knew the code from the inside and wanted to involve Eli. "Back to the hatred, Olof," Eli urged. "Linus was kidnapped as revenge against you. Who suffered the most from the closure you caused? And who had the specialized knowledge to use this code?" Olof took a deep drag from his cigar. The smoke hung in the air like a haze of bitterness. "There are 3 groups of people who want to destroy me," Olof said, his voice growing more bitter. "The board who lost their fortunes, the workers who lost their pensions, and the innocent families who lost their fathers." Olof opened one of the files on his desk. He pointed to the main suspects and described their motives. Bertil Nilsson, ex-director, the architect of the fraud. He lost his power, and a multi-million kroner scandal hung over his head. He is intelligent, methodical, and will see this as a way to take the last thing dear to me, my son. His motive is financial and intellectual revenge. Rune Jönsson, former maintenance chief. He was the most loyal to the mine, but he lost his pension and reputation. He was the apprentice of Einar Hegg, the carver of the reindeer. If anyone knows the code, it is him. But he is more a man of the tunnels than a mastermind. His motive is loss and working-class betrayal. Eva Lindmark, daughter of the suicide victim. Her father, Knut, committed suicide when the pension fund collapsed. She is the embodiment of the innocence that was destroyed. She hates the board for their lies and me for my justice that cost her father his life. Her motive is emotional, personal revenge. Eli took the reindeer in his hand again. He looked at the initials A. E. He now had to take the step that made the case a personal duel. Olof, this goes beyond your fraud files. 30 years ago, my little sister disappeared here. Her name was Astrid Ekman. A.E. Olof swallowed. Astrid Ekman. Yes, the ghost of the village. But Linus's abduction has nothing to do with that. Someone is making the connection, Eli interrupted. The perpetrator knows my history and is using it to lure me back. Jens, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Eli, the Firstfödda reindeer have an older history. There was another disappearance around that time, a year before Astrid. A foreman's child, Axel Engström. He also had the initials A.E. It was dismissed as a runaway. The village elders always kept silent about it. Eli felt the icy hand of the past fully gripping him now. 2 vanished AEs, and now an abduction aimed at Eli's return. Olof, Eli said, who among these people, Rune Jönsson, Bertil Nilsson, or Eva Lindmark, would be most likely to know about the disappearances of both AEs and the reindeer code? Olof pondered. Rune Jönsson, as maintenance chief, knew the families, the tunnels, and the old codes. But Bertil Nilsson was director. He knew all the big secrets, the scandals that were covered up. Rune is too small for such precision work. Eli took the list of names and the reindeer. The focus was now clear. The perpetrator is someone who wants revenge on Olof Ström, the fraudster, and Eli Ekman, the runaway, and who wants to expose the deepest secrets of the mine. The perpetrator must be one of the Firstfödda with a powerful motive. We need to talk to Bertil Nilsson, Eli concluded to Jens. He is the ex-director, the man with the biggest motive for revenge on Olof. We must rule him out as the mastermind. Rune might have supplied the code, but the board provided the motive for the abduction. Moreover, if there are old secrets about the A.E. children, the board definitely knows them. Rune is an employee. Bertil is the man with the key to the cover-up. Jens nodded. Bertil Nilsson is currently at his cabin near Mjölnsjön. A day's drive in this snow, but in the Volvo. Half a day. He hasn't had a visitor in years. Eli grabbed his jacket. That's fine. We have a perpetrator with a motive, or at least 3 suspects with a motive and 1 with a code. We follow the money and the loss of power, because that is the greatest drive in this mine. The man who lost the most is often the most driven culprit. The clock was ticking. Linus was still missing. Eli had to uncover the truth of the past to save the toddler in the present. The hunt would begin with a confrontation with the man who had committed the mine's financial sin. Bertil Nilsson. Chapter 3. The Director's Solitude. The journey to Mjölnsjön was a grueling, hours-long ordeal through the white void. Eli's Volvo was built for the highways of Stockholm, not for the treacherous, ice-covered forest roads of the Swedish interior. Jens sat beside him, a silent, steady presence, driving the utility vehicle with the patient precision of someone raised on the land. It was late morning, but the light was a false promise, a faint, grey sheen that barely reached the treetops. The kaamos maintained its grip on the soul. Bertil Nilsson lives like a recluse, Jens explained, his gaze fixed on the road, which was barely wider than the car. Since the mine closed, He hasn't spoken to anyone but his lawyer. He sold his manor house and bought this small cabin, deep in the woods, by a frozen lake. He literally buried himself in the cover-up, Eli remarked dryly. You could say that. He's afraid, not of the police, but of the people in the village. The board broke the first-footer family ties of the mine. Popular revenge is what he fears. During the long, monotonous drive, Eli forced himself to pull the details of Astrid's case out of the depths of his mind. Jens, noticing Eli's tense silence, began to talk, a rarity for the otherwise taciturn officer. About the reindeer, Eli. I called a few older men from the first fodder. They confirmed that Einar Hegg's reindeer were the code of transfer. If the leg broke, it meant the parents had to hand the child over to another family member. It was an emergency code in times of sickness or necessity. It was about protection, not abduction. But Rune Jönsson, he was the one who maintained those reindeer in recent years. He knew every notch, every family, and every code. So Rune knew the code and the secrets. Bertil knew the money and the scandals, Eli summarized. Exactly. But Rune is, or was, the man who guarded the soul of the mine. Bertil Nilsson was the man who exploited the body of the mine. Eli stared at the endless rows of spruces, each coated in a thick layer of rime. If the perpetrator were purely financially motivated, he wouldn't have used the reindeer code. He would just have left a ransom note. This is a message about history and betrayal. Someone wants me to uncover the truth, not pay a ransom. The thought that Linus's abduction was a deliberate, methodical act to expose a 30-year-old lie was both reassuring and terrifying. It meant that Linus might still be alive, as long as the perpetrator needed Eli to deliver the message. After 4 hours, they reached Mjölnsjön. It was a frozen expanse, so white it hurt the eyes. Bertil Nilsson's cabin stood isolated on a small ridge, with an unobstructed view across the ice. It was a small, unremarkable wooden structure. The plume of smoke from the chimney was the only sign of life. Eli and Jens parked at a distance to avoid alerting Bertil. As they walked the final 100 meters through the deep, silent snow, Eli knocked hard on the heavy wooden door. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of their own breath seemed loud. Finally, a lock slid open on the inside. The door was pulled ajar by a trembling hand. Bertil Nilsson was a shadow of the arrogant director from the old newspaper clippings. His hair was thin and white, his face sunken and covered in an unkempt grey stubble. He wore a thick but dirty wool sweater. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse from disuse. "I have nothing to say. My lawyer." "This isn't about your fraud, Nilsson," Eli said, in a sharp, controlling voice. "It's about Olofström's son, Linus. He has been kidnapped. We believe it's related to revenge against you, the board, and the mine scandals." Bertil's eyes narrowed, but there was fear, not surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "Inside. It's too cold to stand outside," Bertil whispered, reluctantly letting them in. The cabin was warm and stale, filled with the smell of wood smoke and loneliness. The only furniture was a stove, a bed, and a wooden table, strewn with empty bottles and stacks of unread financial reports. Bertil sat at the table, his hands clasped together. "You think this is my revenge on Ström," Bertil said with a cynical smile. "I'm done with Ström. I'm done with everything. But I will tell you, Inspector, the list of people who want Strum to suffer is endless. He robbed many of their dignity and their future. Eli slid the wooden reindeer across the table to Bertil. The missing leg was a silent yet loud accusation. Do you know the reindeer code, Nilsson? The transfer? Bertil stared at the reindeer. His face went ashen. He didn't need to touch it to know its meaning. That's old. That's Einar Hegg's, the Firstfooter family code, he mumbled. I know the symbolism, the child in danger, but I never used that code. But you knew the board's secrets, Eli pressed, leaning over the table. You knew about the financial corruption. Did you also know about the hidden older secrets? The disappearances, Astrid Ekman, Axel Engström, 2 AEs. Did you know that reindeer code was activated 30 years ago? Bertil shook his head vehemently. No, the disappearances. Those were accidents, runaways, the river, the cold. It had nothing to do with the mine. We never talked about it. The board only wanted peace to be maintained. You covered up financial fraud. Why wouldn't you cover up the deaths of 2 children if it would damage the mine's image? Eli's voice was now icy. Bertil looked away, his jaw tight. I wasn't involved in that. Rune Jönsson. He was the man obsessed with those old codes and the families. He was the carver Hegg's apprentice. He claimed a curse rested on the mine. The meeting was crucial, but yielded no direct confession. Eli had seen Bertil's panic at the reindeer code, but he couldn't directly link the man to the kidnapping. The board was the architect of the lie. Rune was the keeper of the secret. Where would Rune Jönsson hide if he wanted to leave a message for the Firstfooter families? Eli asked. Bertil paused, his eyes staring at the frozen lake. If it's a message to the founders, to the old families, there is only one place in the village that represents that code, the Hegg barn. Eli and Jens exchanged a look. The Hegg barn, named after Einar Hegg, the reindeer carver, an abandoned storage facility that served as the unofficial meeting place for the Firstfooter before they went to the mine shafts. Rune Jönsson always used that barn, Bertil said, with a sigh of relief that the focus was off him. He stored his old carvings and tools there. If he left a sign, a final transfer, it will be there. Eli knew Bertil was lying about his innocence in the AE cases, but he believed him about the location. The Hegg barn was the link between the reindeer code and the hidden history. Eli stood up. Thank you for your cooperation, Nilsson. We will be in touch. Back in the Volvo, Eli looked at Jens. Bertil Nilsson is a coward. He buried the financial truth, but I don't think he orchestrated the kidnapping. He fears Rune Jönsson's revenge. The next step must be the Hegg barn. Rune is guiding us along the symbols of his anger. Jens started the engine. The winter silence was broken. The hunt continued, now focused on the man who knew the code and had dedicated his life to the secrets of the mine. Rune Jönsson. Chapter 4. The Hegg barn and the Echo. The journey back from Mjölnsen was quicker, driven by the urgency of a new location and the growing certainty about the perpetrator. The Hegg barn was situated on the outskirts of Åsbacka, hidden behind a dense row of spruces, not far from Eli's childhood home. It was one of the few old wooden structures still standing, built from dark, wind-battered timber. The barn was a silent witness to the mine's founding years. Long before modern, Steel structures dominated the landscape. Eli and Jens parked the Volvo in an abandoned gravel pit and walked the final meters. The snow here was still pristine, leading Eli to suspect that Rune had not approached the barn via the main road. Over the years, the Hegg barn had transformed from a workshop into a dumping ground for forgotten mining materials, rusty wheels, broken wooden slats, and, most noticeably, dozens of bags of iron ore dust, which tickled Eli's nose with the sharp metallic scent of his youth. The door was secured with a thick, frozen padlock. Jens used a crowbar. The sound of cracking wood and metal was too loud in the otherwise absolute silence of the kaamos. When the door swung open, a wave of icy, musty air rushed toward them, mixed with the potent smell of creosote and old wood. Eli shone his flashlight into the darkness. The barn was larger than he expected, with a high ceiling and a tangle of shadows that seemed to be waiting. Rune Jönsson had a workshop here, Jens whispered, following the trail of fine sawdust on the floor. He kept coming here long after he retired. He was obsessed with Einar Hegg's legacy. Eli's gaze fell on a workbench in the corner, covered with a thick layer of dust. Rusty tools hung on the wall above it, chisels, saws, and sandpaper. Rune had spent hours here, preserving the heritage of his mentor, Einar Hegg, the carver of the reindeer. He left something behind, Eli said, walking toward the workbench. On the dust-covered wooden surface lay a small, bright object that contrasted sharply with the darkness. It was a piece of carving that Eli instantly recognized, the broken hind leg of a reindeer. The piece of wood fit exactly with the missing leg of the reindeer Eli carried in his inner pocket. This was no coincidence, no lost toy. The leg had been deliberately placed as the next piece of the puzzle. Next to it lay a folded, aged piece of parchment. It wasn't a letter, but a complex, hand-drawn map of the forests and trails around Åsbacka. In the corner was a sketch of a vast area, marked with a series of coordinates. The location was deep in the Urskog, the ancient forest, an area bordering the sealed mine zone. Jens recognized it immediately. "Those are the coordinates for Post 22, Jens said, his voice strained. "An abandoned mine emergency shelter, used for patrols deep in the wilderness. We thought it had been closed for 20 years. Eli picked up the parchment, his fingers tracing the contours of the handwritten map. This was Rune's guide. Rune had played the dual role of perpetrator and guide. On the back of the parchment, written in crude charcoal letters, was the final message. Ekman, the reindeer are not for money. They are the silence the mine purchased. Seek the truth beneath the frozen heart. Only there will you find what you came looking for." The first teacher. Eli stood in the middle of the cold, dusty barn, and the truth hit him like a physical blow. Rune didn't want a ransom. Rune wanted Eli to dig up the secrets of the mine, secrets that had cost Eli's own sister her life. Eli's mind flashed back to the conversation with Jens. The two vanished A.E. Astrid Ekman and Axel Engström. Rune knew about both children. Rune had linked their fate to Bertil's fraud and Olof's exposure of it. Linus's abduction was a mechanism to expose the ultimate, long-suppressed sin of the Firstfodder families. Eli walked to the darkest corner of the barn, away from Jens. The iron ore smell was strongest here. He took the reindeer from his pocket and held the found leg piece against the reindeer, the broken edges fitting perfectly together. He felt the wooden code was now complete. The symbol of the transfer was now fulfilled in a symbolic sense. This was the point of no return. Eli's professional detachment vanished. He was no longer the inspector from Stockholm. He was the brother seeking the truth of his sister. "Jens," Eli said, his voice flat. "Call dispatch. Tell them we have the perpetrator's location. Rune Jönsson, post 22. Request the fastest possible transport unit, but tell them to await my instructions. I don't want sirens and searchlights. Rune is fragile. If he gets scared, we lose Linus." Jens looked at Eli's sharp, resolute face. He no longer saw a Stockholm agent, but the son of Åsbacka. "Understood, Eli. Discreet. Quiet. We're going to get him." Eli put the wooden reindeer back in his inner pocket. He grabbed the flashlight and the map. Rune had plenty of time to flee. He didn't. He wants to be seen. He wants to be found with the truth. Post 22 will be the location of Linus, but also of the buried history. The cold, empty barn steeped in the scent of the mine was now a starting point. The perpetrator had lured Eli to the heart of the Urskog, to the place where the mine had hidden its worst secrets. "Let's go, Jens. How long is the drive to post 22? By snowmobile, about 2.5 hours if we're lucky. By car, as far as we can go, then on foot. It's the dead zone. There are hardly any trails left." Eli nodded. Every minute counted. Linus had been missing for almost 48 hours. The extreme cold made any delay life-threatening. The final confrontation, deep in the wilderness, would take place in the absolute darkness of the polar night. Chapter 5. Post 22. The Vigil of Death. The journey to Post 22 was the most physically and mentally demanding stage of the entire operation. Rune Jönsson's coordinates led them to the border of the dead zone, a rugged, undeveloped part of the Urskog, ancient forest, where mining activities had ceased decades ago due to inaccessibility. There were no longer any roads, only paths overgrown with snow and ice. Jens had retrieved 2 heavy snowmobiles from the local police station, and Eli and Jens put on thick Arctic clothing that could somewhat temper the cold. Eli drove the second machine. The snowmobiles were their only contact with the civilized world. Central Dispatch had accepted Eli's instructions and waited for further signals from them, at a safe distance from Åsbacka. The snowmobiles roared in the absolute silence of the polar night. Eli focused on following Jens, kept his eyes on the contours of the frozen ancient trees. The beam of their headlights cut through the darkness, and the only sounds were the wind and the crunching of the tracks over the thick, packed snow. The rider was not a relaxed pursuit, but a constant battle against the elements, a test of willpower in the icy wilderness. After more than 2 hours, they sped through a narrow gorge that opened into a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by steep rock faces. Jens stopped abruptly. "This is the area, Eli," he shouted against the wind. "On the mine map, this is called the freezer. The board used to retrieve rare ore samples here, hence the emergency shelter." Post 22 was barely visible. It was a small, inconspicuous wooden structure, half buried under the snow, built against the foot of a steep rock wall. The only indication of someone being inside was a faint, yellowish glow from an oil lamp shining through a small, frosted window. Eli and Jens approached the shelter on foot, their heavy boots crunching in the snow. The silence was so deep, so encompassing, that Eli felt completely isolated from the rest of the world. Eli felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He was now 49 hours into this case and was at the climax, simultaneously operating as an inspector and as Astrid's brother. Eli kept his hand on his service weapon, more out of routine than intent. "Rune led us here, Jens. He doesn't want to fight. He wants to talk. We'll go in discreetly. Linus needs oxygen. We don't have time for negotiations." The heavy metal door of the shelter was unlocked. Eli slowly pushed it open. The warm, stale air inside rushed toward them, mixed with the smell of coal smoke and a sour, metallic scent. Rune Jönsson sat in the middle of the small room, on an overturned wooden crate. He wore a dirty miner's jacket, and his face was a tangle of wrinkles and resentment. He didn't seem surprised. Rather, he looked relieved. He was waiting. The room was austere. A small cast-iron stove glowed in the corner. Next to it was a plank bed covered with old woolen blankets, and in the other corner stood a large, heavy-looking wooden chest, secured with a rusty, massive padlock. Eli's heart skipped a beat. The chest was large enough for a child. But the first thing Eli saw was the man. Rune had the eyes of a broken yet proud man. "Inspector Ekman," Rune said, his voice dry and crackling, as if he hadn't spoken for a long time. "You came. I knew you would understand the code, the son of Astrid's mother." Eli gently let the door fall shut behind him, signaling Jens into the room. Jens took a position by the door, his eyes fixed on Rune. "Where is Linus Ström, Rune?" Eli asked, his voice sharp and authoritative. He pointed to the chest. "What's in there?" Rune Jönsson smiled grimly. "The chest is for the truth. Linus is in a side shaft, safe. He's sleeping. I gave him food and oxygen." Eli's anger flared. "You put a toddler in a locked tunnel. That is murder, Rune." "No, Inspector. That is guarantee," Rune replied. He gestured toward a loose stone in the corner of the floor. "Under that stone is the key to the door of the shaft that leads to Linus. The key is yours, but you only get it after you hear me out." Rune began to speak slowly, the words formed by decades of silence and resentment. "You know Olof Ström exposed Bertil Nilsson's fraud, but that fraud was a small, contemptible lie. I guarded the big lie, the lie that killed your sister." Rune revealed the gruesome truth with a calm that chilled Eli's blood. In the 1980s, they started illegal dumping of chemical waste, liquid metal oxides, deep into the oldest tunnels. The board, including Bertil, knew about it. They dumped it in an abandoned pit, close to the small houses where the first Fodder families lived. In 1985, it began. The children got sick, ostensibly the flu, stomach problems. They were turned away by the doctors. Rune's voice barely broke. Axel Engström, the foreman's son. He was the first. He died a slow, painful death. The board wrote it off as a runaway to prevent a scandal over the toxic dumping. The Reindeer Code, AE 1985, was used to coerce the parents into accepting the story. I had to collect the reindeer and renew them for the next child carving. Eli stood perfectly still. The cold of the cabin now reached his bones, but his inner fire raged. Rune spoke of Astrid. "And your sister, Astrid Ekman, a year later, AE 1986. The board refused to stop the dumping. Astrid always played by the river where the poison seeped through. She got sick, just like Axel. The doctors, they knew, But Bertil bought their silence. They told your mother to leave the town, to bury her memories. Your sister was not kidnapped, nor did she run away, Inspector. She was poisoned by the boar to save the mine. Rune stared intensely at Eli. I had to move the bodies, Eli, in the deepest secrecy. Bertil and the boar forced me. I was a coward. I loved Heg, the carver, and I loved the children. I buried their bodies in one of the old supply shafts, deep underground, and I marked the entrance. He pointed to the large wooden chest in the corner. This chest, Inspector, contains the paper trail. Inside, I have the official diaries of the illegal dumping operations, signed by Bertil Nilsson and the rest of the board. The names of those who murdered your sister and Axel. Rune's voice was now commanding. But the chest is secured with a lock. The key to this chest I have left with Linus. You must dig to find the bodies of Astrid and Axel in the shaft behind this room. Only then does Linus get his freedom, and only then will you have the key to open the truth. Eli understood the game. The shaft key, under the stone, led to Linus and the chest key. The chest key led to the logbooks, the paper trail. The children's shaft led to the bodies, the physical evidence. Rune had created an evidence mechanism that forced Eli to unearth the complete truth. Rune picked up a small, hand-carved wooden reindeer from the stove. This was a third reindeer, undamaged and old. I kidnapped Linus to lure you back with the AEE code. You must find the evidence and show the world that Olof Ström's justice did not go far enough. Eli felt the weight of 30 years on his shoulders. This was blackmail he could not ignore. He had to unearth the truth of the past to save the future of an innocent toddler. Eli walked to the stone in the corner of the floor. He lifted it. A heavy iron key lay underneath, the key to the shaft that led to Linus. You are coming with us, Rune, Eli said, gripping the key tightly. You will tell us exactly where Linus is. Rune nodded resignedly. Of course. The job is done. I have exposed the lie of Bertil and the mine. Linus doesn't need me anymore. I need you to publish the evidence. Jens walked over to Rune to handcuff him. Rune did not resist. He looked at Eli with a faint smile of triumph. You found your sister, Eli. Finally. Eli's rage was gone, replaced by an icy determination. He handed the key to Jens. Jens, go find the shaft. Linus doesn't have much time left. The chest key must be with Linus. I'll stay here with Rune and the paper trail. As soon as you have Linus secure, call dispatch. Tell them to send the forensic team and the public prosecutor to Bertil Nilsson's cabin. We have a double murder case, Jens. A 30-year-old murder case caused by the poison. Jens looked at the chest, at Rune, and then at Eli. He understood the double tragedy that had unfolded in that small cabin. I'll get him, Eli. Jens walked toward the back door of the shelter, which led to the sealed mine shafts. Eli remained behind with the handcuffed Rune Jönsson and the chest that held the gruesome truth of Astrid Ekman's death. The silence had returned, but now it was a silence heavy with consequence. Chapter 6. The Children of the Shaft. The back door of post 22 was a thick steel plate, so heavy it probably required a jack to move it. The rusty edges were sealed by years of frost. Jens inserted the key Eli had given him into the lock. The metal groaned and protested, but finally yielded. Eli and Rune sat motionless, Eli had placed the chest on the floor and pulled the lamp closer. Rune, handcuffed, leaned against the wall with the calm of someone who had completed their life's work. The sound of the door opening and the cold air rushing into the cabin was the only movement in the space. Jens disappeared into the darkness of the corridor leading to the mine shafts. He had lit his heavy miner's lamp, which cast a wide cone of light onto the treacherous, ice-covered ground. The smell here was sharper, a cold, damp mix of metal, stone, and the sharp, unmistakable odor of sealed air. He followed the tunnel for about 30 meters, the route Rune had described, until he saw a small lateral opening, sealed with a second lighter wooden door. Above the door, a number was crudely painted. L. Jens grabbed the doorknob, but it was cracked. He had to force the door open with his shoulder. A soft, almost inaudible whimper reached him. Linus lay on a pile of clean woolen blankets. It was a small niche, protected from the worst drafts, but the cold had already penetrated. The toddler, barely 2, lay on his side crying from fear and cold, but alive. Next to him was a thermos of water, a few wrapped sandwiches, and a small charged oxygen tank that circulated the air. Rune was no monster. He was a methodical hostage-taker. Linus looked up, his eyes wide and red from crying. "Hey, Linus," Jens whispered, his voice as soft as possible. "I'm a friend of your dad's. I'm going to take you home." Jens carefully picked up the toddler. Linus was cold, but quickly warmed up in Jens's heavy jacket. As Jens bundled the boy, he saw a silver, gleaming object on the floor next to the thermos. A small, ornate key with a square head. The chest key. Jens tucked the key into his pocket. Holding the crying toddler tightly against him, he began the long, difficult walk back to the cabin. While Jens was in the tunnels, Eli waited. The silence in the shelter was now almost unbearable. Eli remained seated, staring at the handcuffed Rune Jönsson. "You knew this for 30 years, Eli said, his voice flat. "You waited until Linus was born, until Olof Ström was known, until I returned. This was your testament." Rune nodded, indifferent. "Your arrival was the lock. The circle had to close. Your mother left the town and refused to honor her past. She chose silence. I could not bear the silence. I was the man who buried the dead. I wanted to be the man who unearths the truth." Eli walked toward the back door that Jens had left open. He picked up a pickaxe and a shovel leaning against the wall, tools Rune had used for his preparations. "Where is the shaft of Axel and Astrid?" Eli asked. Rune pointed toward the corner of the corridor. "After 30 meters, in the first recess on the left, there is a large stone carved with the initials AE. Behind it lies an abandoned ventilation shaft. I buried the bodies there, wrapped in the miners' blankets, deep beneath the rubble." Eli looked at the tools. He wanted to dig now, to see the truth, to find his sister, but he could not leave Rune and the chest unattended. Logic prevailed over emotion. Just then, Eli heard the creaking sound of the door opening. Jens entered the room, the silhouette of his heavy jacket distorted by the lamplight. In his arms, he held Linus, pressed tightly against his chest. The toddler's soft cries filled the space. "Linus is safe," Jens said, out of breath, his eyes fixed on Eli. Eli felt a wave of relief that almost made him collapse. He had faced danger, ignored every professional protocol, and put his entire career at risk. But Linus was alive. Jens placed Linus on the bed with the warm blankets. The boy stopped crying and looked at Eli with wide, frightened eyes. Jens knelt beside him and gave him a sip of water. Eli turned to Rune. "The chess key. Does he have it?" Jens pulled the small silver key from his pocket. "This was next to the thermos. Is this it?" Eli took the key. It was the final piece of the puzzle. He walked to the chest and inserted the ornate key into the rusty lock. With a sharp click, the lock sprang open. Eli lifted the lid of the chest. Inside lay stacks of yellowed paper, not loose documents, but carefully bound logbooks with handwritten dates from 1985 to 1988. The logbooks smelled of moisture and chemicals, the scent of the cover-up. Eli leafed through the top logbook. He saw handwriting he recognized from the board members. On page 47, dated May 12, 1986, was a handwritten note signed by Bertil Nilsson. Operation Zinc Water ordered. Dump volume doubled. No reports of illness in Zone 4. Medical file AE closed as runaway. The mine's financial projections must not be jeopardized. Eli's hand trembled. Zinc water, the liquid metal oxide. Zone 4, the area near the river where Astrid played. Bertil Nilsson's signature. This was the hard forensic evidence of death by pollution and the subsequent cover-up. Eli looked up, directly into Rune's eyes. "It's true. It's all in here. You were right." Eli immediately sent Jens to initiate communication with dispatch. Jens hailed them on the emergency frequency. "Linus is safe. Tell them to send an ambulance and a large-scale forensic team to these coordinates. And Jens, call Olof Ström. Tell him his son is safe, but he needs to know that the shaft of truth is still open. And call dispatch. Have them arrest Bertil Nilsson. With these logbooks, we have the evidence for double murder." While Jens contacted the outside world, Eli remained by the chest, the evidence, and the handcuffed Rune. "You did what you had to do, Rune," Eli said, the words heavy. "But you knew I would have to find the children's bodies, didn't you?" Rune looked at Eli with a serene gaze. "The papers are for the law, but the bodies... Inspector, the bodies are for the soul. You must free them, Eli, both yours and theirs. Now you have the power." Eli knelt by the chest. It was the closure of his personal tragedy, but it was also the beginning of a much larger political and forensic disaster for Åsbacka. The silence in the freezer was over. The truth had been dragged from the ground and the tunnels, and its echo would resonate throughout Sweden. Now Eli had to retrieve his sister from the shaft. Chapter 7. The legacy of the first Födda. The cold outside air and the sound of the radio filled the shelter, but Eli barely heard it. His attention was split. He had to guard the chest with the logbooks, but his thoughts were already with the dark shaft leading to Astrid. Jens had set up communications and calmly relayed the coordinates, all while reassuring Linus with soft, continuous monologues. "A large-scale forensic team. The prosecutor for the Gävledala district has been informed," Jens whispered, concluding his work. "They have helicopters ready for Linus's medical evacuation and Rune's transport, but the forensic teams have to come by snowmobile. They estimate an hour." An hour. An hour was an eternity in this valley, a silence Eli had to fill. Eli walked over to Rune, who had slumped his head against the wall, the handcuffs gleaming in the oil lamp's light. "What happens to me, Inspector?" Rune asked, his voice surprisingly clear. "You will be prosecuted for kidnapping, and your testimony in these logbooks will be used to indict the board," Eli replied. "And the bodies?" "They will be recovered and taken to the Forensic Institute. After 30 years, they will rest, Rune, and their families will get answers." Rune smiled, a rare, genuine expression of peace. "It is better this way. The silence was the lie. The snow covered the mine, but not the souls." Eli had closed the logbook bearing Bertil Nilsson's signature. The law had been served. Now came the soul. He looked at the handcuffed Rune, and then toward the corridor. Jens was still busy with communications, cautiously explaining the details of the dumping operation. The forensic teams would arrive, but not for another hour. Eli knew he had to act now. This moment belonged to him and Astrid. As soon as the forensic teams took over, the investigation would become a case, not a personal closure. Eli grabbed the pickaxe. It was a heavy, cold piece of metal. He was no longer the inspector from Stockholm. He was a brother who had to complete his personal mission. Eli reopened the inner door of the mine corridor. The cold hit him like a fist. He followed Jens's footsteps, the lamp in his hand, the heavy pickaxe over his shoulder. The smell of moisture, rust, and stone was intense. The air so cold it hurt his lungs with every breath. After 30 meters, he found the recess on the left. It was darker and narrower than the tunnel that led to Linus. In the middle of the recess lay a flat, irregular stone, worked by a miner's chisel. Eli wiped away the dust and saw the carved initials, AE. Eli put down his pickaxe. The stone was Rune's final marker, the ultimate act of a guilty guardian. Behind the stone was the opening of a narrow vertical ventilation shaft, now abandoned and filled with shale and debris. The shaft was deep and dark. Rune had buried the bodies here, away from official maps, in an anonymous grave. Eli started digging. He worked methodically, not furiously. He used the pickaxe to loosen the larger stones and the shovel to scoop the debris. The sound of metal on rock was dull and harsh in the enclosed space. He dug, and with every scoop, a layer of the 30-year silence fell away from his soul. After digging to a depth that reached his waist, the sound changed. The shovel hit something soft, a muffled thud. Eli stopped abruptly. He dropped the shovel and knelt in the narrow pit. He used his hands, feeling through the icy debris. His fingers touched the fabric of a thick, stiff blanket, the miner's blanket that Rune had used to wrap the children. Eli cautiously pulled up the heavy blanket. It was rigid with cold and chemicals. He folded the edge back, his lamp shining into the darkness of the pit. There they lay, the silent witnesses of the crime. Two small, fragile skeletons embraced by the blanket and the earth. Axel Engström and Astrid Ekman. Eli's breath hitched. There was no drama, no scream, only a deep, suffocating silence. It was not a horrific sight. It was an image of immeasurable sorrow. Time had returned them to the earth, but the blanket had protected them, preserving them. Eli's gaze fell on the remains of his sister, the smaller of the two. And then he saw it. A small, hand-carved object, tightly clutched in her hand, almost fused with the small, delicate bones of her fingers. It was the wooden reindeer, the last reindeer she would ever carve. Rune had left the wrong reindeer with the Strum family. This was hers, sealed in her own silent shaft. Eli touched the soft, smooth wood. The cold penetrated his gloves. It was her touch, her final act. In that moment, the pain of 30 years wasn't gone. It was condensed into a single, fragile second. The chest was the evidence for the law. This was the closure for his heart. He closed his eyes. "Rest in peace, Asti," he whispered. He positioned the lamp so the light fell on the gravesite. He laid the pickaxe and shovel next to the shaft and retreated from the pit, his knees stiff and cold. The brothers' moment was over. Now the inspector had to serve the law. The distant, pulsing sound of a helicopter entered the valley, followed by the heavy roar of multiple snowmobiles. The outside world had arrived. Jens walked into the corridor. "They're here, Eli. The ambulance for Linus and the forensic teams." Eli, with dirt on his clothes, walked back to the cabin. He handed the heavy chest of logbooks to the first concerned-looking officer. He carried the logbooks as if they were made of glass. The complete downfall of the mine's board. The district prosecutor, a sharp, energetic woman, stormed into the cabin. Eli, the man who had been sent north by Stockholm with a strict, unofficial mandate, was suddenly the hero and the key witness. Eli pointed to the handcuffed Rune Jönsson. "This is the perpetrator of the kidnapping, and also the witness." He revealed the location of the bodies in the corridor behind here. And he has identified Bertil Nilsson as the main person responsible for the illegal dumping and the cover-up. He paused and pointed to the chest. These logbooks contain the evidence, the minutes, the signatures, and the code zinc water. Bertil Nilsson must be arrested immediately on suspicion of multiple murder. A forensic team moved toward the dark corridor. Eli gave them the exact location and the reindeer he had found as a forensic clue. He had completed his personal task. He could now leave the rest to the machinery of the law. As Linus was airlifted away and Rune Jönsson was led off, Eli lingered in the cabin for a moment. The oil lamp flickered. The silence was now official, filled with the sounds of communication and evidence gathering. Eli knew he couldn't return to his old life in Stockholm. He had seen the truth in the chest and found the soul in the shaft. His return to Åsbacka had been Astrid's final mission, and it had changed his own legacy forever. Chapter 8. The Aftermath and the Verdict. The valley had transformed from a silent trap into a forensic command center. White tents were erected around the shelter, brightly lit by mobile generators. The Swedish police and prosecutors, unusually swift for an operation in the kaamos, had taken control. Eli stood in the cold, brightly lit snow. He had given his statements, handed over the logbooks, and Rune Jönsson had already been transported by snowmobile to the nearest base. Jens Ström stood beside him, his face marked by the anxiety of the past few days. "They stabilized Linus," Jens said, his voice hoarse. "He's already on his way to the hospital in Kiruna. Olof heard the news. He is grateful." Eli nodded. Olof Ström's gratitude felt fleeting. Eli knew Olof thought he had defeated the directors by exposing their financial fraud. But the truth now emerging from the ground, the murder of children by poison, would confront Olof with the incompleteness and superficiality of his own struggle. This realization would undoubtedly plunge him into a new, deeper crisis. While the forensic teams worked in the mine corridor, news arrived from Åsbacka. A police unit had surrounded Bertil Nilsson's cabin. He had not resisted. "Bertil Nilsson has been arrested," Jens said, having listened to his radio. "He's in custody. The preliminary charges are embezzlement and endangering public health. The prosecutor wants to match the evidence from the logbooks with the bodies before pursuing charges of multiple murder." Eli looked toward the shaft. The match wouldn't take long. The logbook and the bodies were two undeniable sides of the same coin. The fall of the mine board had officially begun. In the morning, when the twilight finally broke the absolute darkness, a transport brought Eli and Jens back to Åsbacka. The village was still unaware of the full scale of the disaster. The official narrative was still the kidnapping of Linus, now resolved. Eli's first and most important task was the confrontation with his mother. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table where he used to do his homework as a child. She had the radio playing softly. Her eyes were red, but she was composed. "Linus is safe, Mom," Eli said, his voice soft. She looked up, her face a mix of resentment and relief. "I know. Olof called. He thanked you. He said, 'You found the truth in the mountains.'" She spoke the word truth with a bitterness Eli recognized. "Astrid wasn't kidnapped, Mom," Eli said, with the cold, clinical precision of the inspector. "She didn't run away in 1986. She got sick from the mine's toxic dumping. She was poisoned with heavy metals, and her death was covered up by the board to save the mine." His mother closed her eyes. Eli had expected her to collapse, to scream. Instead, her face hardened. I knew something was wrong when the mine doctors came here. I knew the mine was lying," she said, barely a whisper. "They told me I had to leave, that it was the spirits of the ground. They wanted me, the victim's mother, to believe it was the fault of the first fodder. That's why I left Åsbacka, to survive the lie." Eli's own resentment vanished. The silence and the distance had not been a personal rejection. It was a survival mechanism against a monstrous lie. "We found her, Mom. Her remains, and Axel Engström's. They were in a shaft. We have the logbooks proving it. Bertil Nilsson is arrested." A tear rolled down her cheek, the first and only one. She reached out and touched Eli's hand. "Bring her home, Eli. Make sure she's buried here, not in that cold, wet earth." The long, unspoken mission was complete. Eli remained in Åsbacka to finalize the case and serve as the main witness. The revelation of the toxic dumping sent a shockwave deeper than the kidnapping of Linus. The mine, which had created and sustained the community, had betrayed them and murdered their children. Eli saw the shift in the village. The silence that the first fodder had carried for generations turned into rage. The Swedes in the village, who had always defended the mine, were now confronted with the poison beneath their feet and the corruption of their leaders. Jens Ström took the lead in the local police investigation. He and Eli worked the final days as a true team, their original rift now closed by the shared truth. Eli visited Rune Jönsson in his cell before he was transferred to Kiruna. Rune was calm and grateful. "The code worked, Inspector. You opened the mountain." Rune would spend years in prison for the kidnapping, but Eli knew Rune would live the rest of his life with the knowledge that he had brought justice to Astrid and Axel. A week later, as the sun briefly appeared above the horizon in the short daylight, Eli prepared to return to Stockholm. He had declined Dahlberg's invitation to officially lead the case. His task in Åsbacka was finished. He stood by the small wooden caravan, the symbol of his temporary, uneasy return. Jens came out, wrapped in a heavy coat. "Bertil Nilsson has denied all charges," Jens said, "but the logbooks are irrefutable. The prosecutor is confident that the charges of multiple murder will stick." Jens reached out his hand to Eli. "Thank you for Linus and for the truth." Eli shook his hand. "I never would have found Rune without you, Jens. Stay here. This place needs you." Eli drove away. He drove past the main buildings of the Åsbacka mining company, which were now officially shut down by the public prosecutor's office, with evidence tape and warning signs everywhere. The kaamos no longer felt like an enemy. The darkness had protected the truth. He drove south, toward the first glimpse of the long-awaited pale sun. As the hills of Åsbacka disappeared behind him, Eli made a life-changing decision. He would honor his sister's legacy. He picked up his phone and called Chief Inspector Dahlberg. "I am not accepting the promotion to the Central Division," Eli said, his voice firm. "I am submitting my resignation from the Stockholm police. I am moving back to Åsbacka." "Åsbacka?" Dahlberg replied, incredulously. "What will you do there, Inspector?" "I am going to help my mother, and I am going to oversee the cleanup. I am going to run for the town council. The mine killed the village. I am going to return the power to the people who live here. This is my home, Dahlberg, and I am going to cleanse it, stone by stone, and soul by soul." Eli ended the call. The sun shone on his face. For the first time in 30 years, Eli Ekman wasn't searching for a disappearance. He had found his past. His future was in the north, rooted in the snow, in the fight for justice he had just begun. 3 months later, winter had held Åsbacka firmly in its grip, but the kaamos had broken. The sun, now a pale but tangible presence, hung low over the snow-covered hills. The legal storm Eli had unleashed had reached the entire country. Bertil Nilsson and 3 other board members were formally indicted for multiple manslaughter and severe economic crimes. The forensic reports were irrefutable. The heavy metals in the shaft were the cause of death for both Axel Engström, 1985, and Astrid Ekman, 1986. The community had embraced the truth with a mix of sorrow and rage. Eli's mother had arranged for Astrid and Axel to share their final resting place at the old Åsbacka cemetery, not far from the river where they once played. The funeral was a somber, solemn event. Many members of the Firstfödda families were present, including Axel's parents, who could finally bury their son. Eli and his mother stood at the grave alongside the Engström family. Eli felt the cold, clean wind on his face. He had fulfilled the promise to his sister and his mother. The silence he had known for 30 years was replaced by a collective, shared grief, which was stronger than the lie. After the ceremony, Eli drove to Olofström's house, which, now free from the threat of an indictment, was once again his home. Linus had been discharged from the hospital a few weeks earlier. Eli found Olof and Linus in the living room. Linus, with his blonde hair and the look of a toddler who had seen too much, was playing on the floor. Olof stood up to greet Eli. He looked aged, but sincere. "They say you're staying here, that you're focusing on the town council." "That's right," Eli said. "This is where the fight needs to be fought now." Olof's eyes were not grateful, but confronting. "I fought the finances, Eli. I fought the money. You found the bodies. I missed the real crime all this time. My justice was too small." "Your fight against the fraud is what started this entire chain reaction, Olof," Eli said. "Without your actions, Bertil never would have gotten nervous, and Arun never would have seen the chance to kidnap Linus. We were a chain reaction. Your fight wasn't too small. It was the necessary spark." Olof accepted Eli's words. He nodded slowly. He walked to Linus and picked up his son, who instinctively clung to his neck. It was their first full, unchallenged reunion in their own house since the kidnapping. "I need to thank you," Olof said, his voice cracking, "as a human and as a father." Eli placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of him and keep fighting." A few days later, Eli stood on the highest bare peak of the mountain outside Åsbacka. He was not wearing a uniform, but the heavy winter clothes of a local. He looked down at the village. The snow-covered houses glowed in the soft orange light of the morning sun. It offered a sense of hope and promise. Eli had handed over the keys to the small wooden caravan. He was now a citizen, a reformer, a resident. His mother waited in the family home for Eli to rebuild life in Åsbacka together. The battle against the mine's legacy would be difficult. The cleanup, the political corruption, and the distrust had to be rebuilt stone by stone. But he had found the truth in the shaft. Eli turned and looked north. He saw the gleam of the innocent snow and the vastness of the land. He was finally back, not as the son who fled, but as the man who had returned to honor the dead and save the living. His task was not complete, but the first dawn of justice had appeared. Down below, in the bright morning snow, he saw a solitary wooden swing set on the small hill behind the school. A few meters away, little Linus, his face beaming, was deftly climbing over a snowdrift that winter had left behind. His small red hat was a bright, vivid accent against the white and the pale sunlight. Linus was proof that life, however damaged, always found a new youth in the north, a youth that Astrid and Axel were never afforded, but which had now been secured for him by the battle Eli had won.